Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this, our National Science Week panel for Bayside Gallery. This particular exhibition is part of the programming for our latest exhibition at Bayside Gallery, Greenworld. Whilst you can't visit the actual exhibition itself, you can visit online. There will be a link at the end of this session. Bayside City Council would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land, the Boon Wurrung people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. The exhibition that this show relates to today, Greenworld, comes to us at a time when, as city dwellers in lockdown, our appreciation for the green and open spaces of our parks, creeks and rivers and shorelines has strengthened. The exhibition reflects on the power of nature to offer relief, sustenance and inspiration during these times of intense interiority. Our panel today brings together some incredible people who will help us explore the themes within the exhibition and the benefits that nature can offer us all in our daily lives. Facilitating our panel today is Associate Professor Mardie Townsend from Deakin University. Associate Professor Townsend is involved in a collaboration with Parks Victoria and other partner organisations in investigating the benefits of contact with nature for human health and wellbeing. Our panellists today include Nicole Forshew. Nicole is an artist in our current exhibition, Greenworld, and is also a writer and curator from the Wiradjuri Nation in central west New South Wales. Forshew's practice incorporates mediums including photography, video and sculpture, through which she maintains an ongoing thematic exploration of her heritage through contemporary and innovative frameworks. All the way from Utah in Salt Lake City, we have Professor David Strayer. Professor Strayer runs an applied cognition laboratory at the University of Utah. His work examines human attention and the limits of human multitasking ability. He studies how attentional capacities can be restored by interacting with nature. We also have today Sarah Aleli. In 2015, after a bicycle accident, Sarah was unable to read, write, watch television or listen to podcasts. She discovered her path to recovery was through nature. She's creator of the successful podcast series, Brain on Nature. And finally, today we have Tristan Snell. Tristan is a senior lecturer and counselling psychologist at the School of Psychology, Faculty of Health at Deakin University. Tristan's research interests are in counsellor education and environmental psychology, particularly the impact of the physical environment on mental health and learning, as well as encouraging sustainable environmental behaviours. And I'd now like to hand over to our facilitator today, Professor Mardie Townsend.
Thanks very much, Helen. We have a wonderful group of panellists with us today, so I don't want to delay any longer in giving them a chance to share their wisdom with us. Given that Bayside Council has titled this session a Healing Nature Panel, I'd like to begin with a first-hand experience by asking Sarah to tell us a bit about how, after your bicycle accident, which left you unable to read, write, watch TV or listen to podcasts, you discovered that your path to recovery was through nature. How did that happen?
Hi, well, I suffered a mild traumatic brain injury when I had my bike accident. It took quite a long time for that to be diagnosed though. It was a concussion and, you know, the brain's complicated and I've probably learned a lot in the 5 years since, but it's not an immediate diagnosis. And so I just was suffering from a lot of headaches and my focus and concentration was severely impaired and I really struggled with noise and sound, which is why I decided to make the podcast. And I just, in the weeks after my bike accident, I would just sit out in my garden and stare at trees and found that was literally the only thing I could do. And I remember thinking, I'm so lucky I don't live in an apartment and just have to stare at walls. I think I would quite literally go crazy. But my brain wasn't working in such a way that I could go, oh, this must be something. I'll jump on Google, I'll do some research. I just thought, oh, this is just my experience right now. Didn't think anything more of it. And then a couple of weeks after the accident, I was really struggling to deal with the noise of my young children. I literally just couldn't cope being in a house with them. And I went to stay with a friend at North Bondi and just spent a weekend in her quiet house and went to the beach and just sat and stared at the waves and found that that was the only thing. I had constant headaches at that point and it just was the only thing that would alleviate my headaches. I still didn't join the dots between the garden and the beach. And then about a month after that, some friends invited me on a bushwalk, and I took my kids and my mother-in-law, who was visiting from Chicago, and we did this bushwalk, and I just felt the fog clearing. Like suddenly I could think straight, I could follow a conversation, I didn't have a headache. And I just had this light bulb moment of, wow, there's something about nature. But again, I still didn't join the dots between, I just went, oh, being in the bush, being in the forest seems to be working. I still wasn't joining dots. My brain wasn't quite capable of that or doing any research. So I started sort of self-medicating, basically, like going on more and more walks. And, you know, I'd been someone who was interested in the natural world, but I certainly didn't go on hikes by myself. I started going for walks with friends, and when I felt well enough, I'd go on bushwalks by myself, and would just find that it made a huge difference to my focus and concentration. And I eventually, about 5 months after the accident, stumbled across when I was at the point that I could read articles in doctors' waiting rooms where I was spending a lot of time, I found an article about the connection between gardening and mental health, and went, oh, that's interesting. I mentioned to a friend, she pointed me to another magazine article where David Strayer was interviewed and a bunch of other American researchers. And I thought, oh, wow, there's science to this. And, you know, and I'm a journalist, and I thought, when I get better, I want to make a documentary about this. And so knowing that there was science and it wasn't just my anecdotal experience, I really sort of amped up the self-medicating, and eventually went on to, I wanted to find out what's the dose and what is it about nature and how can I further, because my recovery was quite long. It took a few years to really get better. And so I used nature throughout that time, and I continue to use nature to improve my focus and concentration. And, you know, it's great now we're all working from home. It's easy to pop out into the garden, but when I was in an office, I'd go to the park at lunchtime and just sort of know when I need to. Tomorrow I'm taking off for a day to go for a bushwalk for, you know, a long hike, and I know that will sort of recharge me for the rest of the week. Yeah.
Great. And are there any particular forms of interaction with nature that you found especially beneficial?
Look, I think being by myself is probably better. Like, for instance, tomorrow I'm going for a walk with friends, and I know that I'll find myself sort of drifting away from the group a bit to sort of be away from all the chatter. But I know that, and I found this when I was doing the research as well, that from researchers I spoke to, like, really, ideally you're by yourself, you know, or else you're with someone where sometimes I'll go for a bushwalk and we'll just not talk much, and being present. Like, I think it's also about connecting with the natural world and reconnecting. So it may not be, I'm noticing that it's not so much the time spent out, but it's, for me, the quality of that time. And so if I go, you know, so in terms of, like, I guess it's really noticing what's going on with those trees, or really looking at the shells on the beach, or really kind of just being very present and aware of what is happening in the natural world, and sort of honing in on that.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. That's great. David, moving on to you, your research focuses on human attentions and the limits of human multitasking ability, and how attentional capacities can be restored by interacting with nature. And I have to say, this is very pertinent for many families in Melbourne right now, where in lockdown, parents are trying to do their own work as well as homeschool their children. Can you give us a simple explanation, a few sentences in relatively layperson terms, of the findings of your research into attention restoration through interaction with nature?
Sure. Thanks, by the way, for having me all across the world here. I'm happy to participate. I think that much of what Sarah just mentioned was what kind of guided the research from my lab and others as well, trying to understand something about how connecting with the natural world, something we call biophilia, the love of living things, brought us back to kind of a kind of our evolutionary roots, our history as humans. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. That's the research that I do. And so I was really trying to understand what's happening in my brain, what's happening in your brain, what's happening in your kids' brains when they are out in the natural world. And what we see, just behaviorally, are improvements in creativity, reductions in stress. People have less anxiety, and basically working memory improves. So you just tend to think more clearly. You let a lot of the clutter float away, and so so from just a behavioral perspective, we can see that there's all kinds of benefits. People report having less stress, having more positive affect, and so we've been doing a lot of situations where we'll take people out into the natural world. We have deserts that are very similar to kind of the outback of Australia, the big red rocks and everything like that where I live. And so we'll take groups of people, measure their brain activity up in the city, then take them out into the wilderness, to the forest, to the deserts for a week, and look to see what changes in their brain. And without getting into all the specifics, I could share all that. But what we're seeing are that there are some really interesting changes in the attentional networks that are consistent with a lot of less rumination, a lot more kind of being in the moment. And that's the whole body experience. It's the brain, it's the body, it's the heart. You find changes in blood pressure. You see changes in heart rate. You see changes in cortisol, which is related to stress. You see changes in like the T cells that are responsible for our immune system. And one of the things that are kind of really important with, say, coronavirus these days, that's one of the things that may be our savior. So nature restores us, and it restores us, our mind and our body. And I'm happy to chat more about it, but basically the long and the short of it is we can find biomarkers of that restorative experience.
Great, thanks, David. And what are some of the applications of this research, and how could it help us in this time of lockdown?
Well, this is a stressful time for many people. They are uncertain about, this actually has the coronavirus that we have has a real insidious part where you may be infected for some period of time, and that may be stressful, but you're unaware of it. And so that whole kind of, am I infected? Is somebody I know infected? That kind of stress is the kind of stuff that really can actually just drive you crazy. So if you can go out to the garden, if you can go on a walk, if you can go to the beach, if you can, in the back of the background, you see in Tristan's screen there, you see the water, you see the greenery kind of moving around. Those are the kinds of things that gently capture our attention and restore us. What we know from some of the, one of the things that Sarah mentioned was kind of recovering from an injury. Some of the people who show the biggest benefits are our soldiers coming back after multiple tours in Afghanistan or Iraq. They oftentimes have severe Ptsd, and they actually really tend to show real remarkable improvements when they get into the natural environment in a safe, kind of comforting way.
Great. Thanks very much, David. That's terrific. Now, Nicole, I know from the research I was involved in with one of my former PhD students, now Dr. Yotty Kingsley, that for Indigenous Australians, connection to country is very important for physical, mental, social and spiritual well-being. As a Wiradjuri person, you have a unique and powerful relationship with your traditional country. Can you tell us how your work as an artist reflects on that relationship and the responsibilities that come with it?
Thank you. Yaradu Marang, Nirumbangambangia, Nirumbang Wiradjuri. So I'm on Gumbaynggirr country and my connections are homelands through Wiradjuri. And I think it's really as simple, I guess, as it's a deep spiritual relationship and connectedness to homelands and country. And I guess that's the motivation of my work. But I think the work that's shown in Greenworld is really about the experiences of working with mineral collections. So there's two things. There's the obvious deep spiritual connection to the work that I do and the materiality of the work. But there's also the importance of prominent museums and galleries raising the awareness of those mineral collections that are often kept away or hidden, and also how artists, and in particular Aboriginal artists, can really access those earth science collections as a bank of physical and biological cultural information. And that sounds kind of complex, but it's not really. It really is about memory, and it's about culture, and it's about connecting to those. And that's really what the work Unburden is about. It came off the back of about a 3 to 5 year study of minerals with the Australian Museum. It was an exhibition. The work was commissioned by Jam Factory in South Australia by Margaret Davis and Kobe Edgar. And it was really an opportunity to work with the South Australian Museum, has probably one of the biggest and most amazing earth science collections. And so I had the opportunity to go in and photograph and spend some time with that collection. And they're more than just objects. So it's kind of like the repatriation of spirituality. It's also giving new insight to some of the researchers and scientists. I brought my mum in and family into the Australian Museum collection, and my mum says, oh, I used to play with these when I was a kid, you know, like garnet. She was born and bred on a mission that ended up, you know, at the time of her being 8 or 9 years old, was one of the largest open cut mines in the whole of New South Wales. So, we've had a close relationship between, you know, very different relationships. So spirituality, connectedness, but then also the degradation of land too, and what the impacts of that are through mining.
Right.
So the work connects to all of those things.
And you've photographed these small fragments of minerals, rock, clay, wood, and you've reproduced them larger, about the size of a human face. And they're displayed in the gallery in a row, like you would a series of portrait photographs. Was this your intention, to elevate these scientific specimens and give them back their human significance in some way?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have a term in Wiradjuri which is called Naga, and Naga means sacred. And so it's the most sacred relationship that you can have between what we call Miran, which is the body. And so the sacredness of the body and the sacredness between country and spirituality. And if you have a look at the works, what I was really interested in was how minerals that were excavated from incredibly complex, you know, deep within the Earth's atmosphere, excavations, and then also how they're kept in museums to maintain the materiality and the natural elements of those minerals, and really using different techniques, which the scientists that I work with, they were really excited about getting really close up to the mineral, but not so much in a sense of like, you know, mathematics or measurement or trying to evaluate the mineral. It was more so trying to bring and raise awareness of its form and also its sense of spirituality within that. So you'll see beautiful gypsum pieces that have grown onto the surface of amazing ochre and branches. And people have said to me, oh, did you make that object before you photographed it? And I said, no. So the earth created that. I didn't have to do anything except raise awareness of it and also engage people to look at them a little bit more differently. But the thing is that we often don't have that access in the way that we used to when we used to carry out ceremony. And Marie Clark, if I can just mention, also did amazing work where she looked at the kopi, which was the gypsum mourning material. And so the relationship between earth, culture, ceremony and art, it's just all intertwined, and it's pretty easy to do if you have the camera.
It's fantastic that you are bringing art and using art to shine a light on science. And then to open both of those up to those of us who may be neither skilled in neither area, but can come to understand and appreciate things through your work. So thank you. That's terrific.
Thanks.
Sarah, just as Nicole has used her artistic skills to communicate about the human connection to nature, you've also used your creative skills to create your Brain on Nature podcasts. And could you tell us a bit about your podcasts and the responses you've received to them, and then what comes next?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so Brain on Nature is a 6-part narrative nonfiction podcast, and it's very sound rich. So I wanted, I'm a journalist. I was working in TV when I had the accident, and when I found out that there was science to this and there was a story, I thought, I want to make a documentary. Initially thought I'd make film because that's what I worked in, but actually the medium that I really enjoy personally consuming is audio and podcasts. And also I realized that my story actually was about sound, because brain injuries can manifest in many ways, and a lot of people end up with real problems of looking, they have to lie in a dark room, whereas I didn't have that. What I found was sound, and so I had to go to a quiet room, or I had to go to the forest, or I had to go to the beach. And so I wanted to recreate my experience of having a brain injury in a sort of really sound rich way through the podcast, and so that people can experience the sort of really, like, everything was at the same volume, because what happens is our brains actually know to hone in on that conversation, or there's the person standing in front of me talking to me, and you listen to that and you actually cancel out a lot of noise. And my brain wasn't doing that. I just heard everything at the same volume. And whereas I found the sounds of nature was soothing, and it was the opposite. And so the podcast, and I've had some incredible responses from people who've had brain injuries, who've written in saying, some people actually said it was almost too much for them. Like, they were like, can you do a version that's not so sound intense, because it's just like, my brain can't cope. And then other people have been, wow, like, I thought I was alone. They just completely relate to the experience. And they say that, that was their experience as well, that they also found sounds were really triggering for them. And I had a lot of, it's been wonderful. I mean, part of the reason I wanted to make the podcast was because no doctor prescribed nature for me. Even when I told my specialist and my neurologist that I was finding nature really effective, they didn't discourage it. They were like, oh yeah, we'll keep doing what you're doing. But they continued to try all these different medications. I was on all sorts of things. They tried antidepressants because that's supposed to help with migraines. They tried injecting Botox into my head, and none of these things worked. And, afterwards I interviewed my neurologist, and he was great. And he said he completely agreed and supported with what I would found. But when I said, well, why don't you prescribe this? If someone else walks in tomorrow, will you tell them? He said, I'll point them to your podcast, but I can't tell them as a neurologist, as a doctor. They haven't, because it's very hard with nature to go and do double-blind placebo tests. So I wanted to tell other people about this, but also, you don't need a brain injury to be able to benefit from this. And so I've had a lot of people write in and just say, oh wow, you've inspired me to go and spend more time outside, and that's wonderful for it. And while I was making the podcast is very much my own story with with science. So I interviewed David Strayer, interviewed yourself, Marty, and a bunch of other US researchers and philosopher Dalia Nassar, and all my specialists, and sort of fused in the science with my own personal narrative. But I've got young children, and while making the podcast and also just my own experiences, I will really notice how much they benefit from reconnecting with the natural world. And I think as we've become more inside, all of us are spending more time inside and on screens, even before COVID, that getting people to understand how important it is to get kids outside and reconnecting with the natural world is really important. And I'm quite interested in how nature improves the behavior of kids, and can really help with things like ADHD, or just any sort of challenging behavior, but also just the average kid, like how great it is for them to get outside. And so I've been raising some funds to do. I've got a crowdfunding page. You can go to brainonnature.com if you want to help out to make the next season of Brain on Nature, which is your kids' Brain on Nature, which the idea is it's for parents and grandparents and carers and educators to learn more about how to reconnect, but also hear stories of where people's lives have been transformed by spending more time outside.
That's great. And that leads us beautifully to Tristan and your work. Tristan, your bio notes that your research interests focus on the impacts of the physical environment on mental health and learning, and that you're particularly interested in disadvantage in education and the workplace. Could you share some of your thoughts about the effects of COVID-19 and particularly the current stage 4 restrictions here in Victoria on the 3 areas of mental health, education and workplaces, and how nature might intervene there for positive outcomes?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, there's a really great term I read. It was in relation to climate change, but it was essentially this idea that climate change, for instance, acts as a poverty multiplier, right? So more disadvantaged groups are going to suffer more because of these sorts of changes that happen to the environment. And I think it applies really nicely to this issue as well, access to natural environments. So we've got a situation now, right, where most of the population are working from home. And that's a real poverty multiplier. When you're living in, a small apartment, you don't have access to gardens, perhaps, or nice views of nature. The impacts then on your mental health are going to be far more severe relative to, say, people who live by the beach with nice open spaces. And so in that sense, potentially an issue like COVID-19 and these sort of restrictions can really multiply the impacts of disadvantage, and particularly in relation to access to nature. It's a big issue for kids as well. I think there's really great evidence on the value of contact with nature for children and the long-term impacts as well for some of the research we've completed, just looking at the relationship between contact with nature in childhood and adult depression. But there's quite a few good studies now looking at how the more time children can spend playing in nature, and free and creative play as well can result in really positive impacts: creativity, reduced use of psychiatric medication. So it's a powerful and it's an important environment, and it's one that, with a lot of people living in cities, people have less access to. So I guess in terms of a solution, though, I'm just talking about problems now and how difficult it all is. But there probably is some really good solutions. It doesn't have to be this way. And I mean, for one thing, it's partly about making sure we have environments that are suitable for living and access to public parks. But even then, when it's impossible, right, we can use things like making sure that apartments and houses have appropriate natural light. But even then, we can have things like we can have beautiful artwork as well. So that there's good research on having images of nature, virtual images of nature, virtual reality that could be used in settings where access and views to nature are impossible. And they're not substitutes, but it is potentially a remedy to that disadvantage, which might be otherwise impossible to overcome.
Yes, thank you. That's great. Some years ago, Tristan, I did some research with an organisation that worked with abused children, and I remember interviewing one of the counsellors. He was a psychologist, and he worked with these young children, and he just by accident really took his dog into work one day, and a small child was brought in and had said nothing and had been really mute for some considerable period of time, wouldn't say anything. And he brought the dog in and he said, "Now look, this is Jack the dog, and you know, he'd like you to pat him." And he got the little girl to pat the dog and gradually become more familiar with it. The next time she came in, he made sure that he had Jack the dog there. And she came in and she immediately started patting Jack the dog. And with prompting, gentle prompting from him in the background, she began to tell Jack the dog about what had happened to her and to unload the difficulties she'd had in life. I'm wondering if you can identify opportunities for linking nature with your counselling practice to capitalise on the benefits that you've highlighted.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm supervising a PhD student at the moment who's looking at how to improve counselling rooms, for instance, by incorporating more natural elements. With the hope that this might help people to perhaps feel more relaxed, less anxious, disclose more. There's very limited research in that area. I should say more broadly, I think it's a little bit of a strange idea think about it from a cultural context, that if you have a mental health issue, your solution might be to sit in a dark room with somebody and talk about it in an enclosed space. It's a little bit odd, and it doesn't always work, and particularly with people from cultures where that's not the typical practice. So I've spoken to some amazing counsellors who work with clients from the South Pacific, and they've suffered and suffering a great amount of sort of displacement because of what's happening to their lands. But with these clients, it doesn't really work so well to sit in an enclosed space. You have to make sure there's access to natural, to at least views out the window and images, and perhaps not sitting in a enclosed space, perhaps in an ethical and responsible way, going out into nature to talk, perhaps in a way that still maintains privacy and all of this. But the whole field you're talking about there, in terms of using animals in terms of for therapy, is just a wonderful area of research, and consistently showing how effective it is to incorporate non-human elements. Some great research with veterans suffering from PTSD in the US. With equine therapy. And there are so many counsellors and psychologists who do take their dog into counselling, and they don't really talk too much about it or do research about it, but it's so common, and it's just wonderful the impact it has on kids in particular, in terms of their being able to disclose, and it reduces the anxiety. It really makes it, can make therapy a lot more effective, easier, I would suggest. Yeah.
Great. And David, I'm wondering if you could share with us the extent to which and the ways in which nature-based art has been or has the potential to be used in your work on attention restoration.
Well, we know that, like I mentioned earlier, that there's this natural affinity that humans have to living things. So if your art is making a strong connection. I have a number of friends who, when we go to the desert, kind of more relaxing than research-wise, they are artists and will bring their canvas down and paint plein air. And the images that they can create when they're actually in the moment are far better than what they can create in the studio. And so I think that a lot of times that art is much more connected directly to the natural world. As Tristan mentioned, there are all kinds of benefits that have been documented when you can if you're inside, to be able to look outside. We know that if you have a window, people recover from surgery faster if they can look outside as opposed to just being in a room without a window. Why would looking out a window matter? Well, because there's something that's alive and you can actually see the movement, and it helps to connect you with the real world. So there are all kinds of tangible effects. We know that with respect to things like kids, that they don't need some of the medication for ADHD when they're out in nature, because a lot of the problems and issues they have are sitting in this kind of a sterile classroom environment. So I guess with respect to some of the issues under lockdown, if you can go out in the backyard, if you had that opportunity, or two, it can be a dirt field, it can be a park, it can be a beach, and just let the kids get dirty and play. That playing in the natural environment is very restorative.
Yes, absolutely. I have 5 grandchildren who go up. We have a country property of 17 acres of hill country, and they go up there and just love it. And they're constantly asking, when can we go there again? It's just a complete transformation for them. Look, question really for the whole panel, and just indicate to me when you'd like to speak. In these testing times of crisis around the world, it's the nurturing aspects of our lives that we fall back on to sustain us. Access to nature has been shown to be such a crucial element in the daily lives of city dwellers, but we've also seen the importance of creativity as a sustaining and uplifting force in people's lives. My daughter-in-law, for example, has been doing an online art course, which has been wonderful for her and for her children, and it's been really nurturing in that way. I'd like you all to share your reflections on the parallels between these two worlds, nature connection and creativity, and the importance of supporting and encouraging our creative, imaginative, nature-aware selves. Who'd like to go first? Don't all rush me.
Well, I'll just start just to lead up the science. We were interested in the role that creativity how creativity might be boosted being in nature. So we used some standardized measures of creativity, either before or after people had been in nature, unplugged from all the technology for 3 or 4 days. And their scores improved by 50%, a huge improvement. It's one of the biggest changes you can see. And it's consistent with if you get some kind of you're trying to work on a problem and you hit a block, go out if you can for a walk, go out in the garden for a little bit. And what'll happen is a lot of times the solution to what you were trying to figure out pops into your head. So we know that nature does facilitate kind of creative thinking.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Somebody else? Tristan.
I guess I should add, so I guess some of the studies I've seen look at differences between the way that children play in, say, an indoor environment versus a natural environment. And consistently, it seems that children engage in more risky and creative modes of play. So it's probably true. Well, sort of undertaking this research at the moment, but the more access to natural environments that kids have to play, probably they're picking up loose parts, things that have fallen on the ground, and it is likely to mean that they're going to be more creative in certain ways in adulthood. And it's probably as well, I should say, more important for kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds because they don't necessarily have access to all the Lego and various other toys that other kids have. So access to nature is perhaps, and playing in natural places is more important in terms of developing their creativity and having a setting where they can engage in those modes of play.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just echoing what you guys are saying. From personally, my experience is absolutely like I live near a sort of urban river, the Cooks River in Sydney, and I'll go for a walk and I can just feel whatever problem I'm trying to solve. I make podcasts and radio, and it's amazing how the answers just come to you as you're walking and emptying your mind. And I was sort of deliberately try and empty my mind and just stop kind of ruminating and allow that space to happen. And I find it quite noticeable. And also with my children that they really, I've got a daughter who's quite, she's I think can be quite high energy and high demand. And when we go for bushwalks or when we go camping especially, and camping's the best because you're actually away for a period of time and you really see it happening, but they'll get so lost in their little worlds and their creativity that comes out, is amazing. Whereas when you're home, it's like, I'm bored, can I watch TV? You know, and they can get into their worlds of drawing. It's not like they can't be creative, but there just seems to be so much more possibility when you take them outside and where there isn't any, the horizon is just, you know, literally that much further away. And I feel like you can just see their minds just loosening up and not being so constrained by the fact that there's other distractions that are like the screens and things that will make them, I don't know, they don't seem to say they're bored when we're camping. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm bored, but yeah, they'll just find something to do, whereas at home, you know, you'll get that. So yeah, absolutely.
And Nicole, I mean, your work is the epitome of the link between creativity and nature awareness. It's wonderful. You know, I just wonder, does this reflect, and is this more typical of people who have a connection to the land, that you are more capable of this creativity that reflects that?
Probably. I think I find the term creativity, for me, it's more about culture. And for me, I think, you know, and for me, I think about, like, I'm just trying to summarize, and I've been hearing a whole lot of different perspectives, and I'm really interested in the psychology of it all as well. But I think for Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in particular in Australia, it just only highlights the time that we're in and how incredibly wealthy we are in terms of our landmass. But what it also has highlighted is that if Aboriginal people are not connecting to country, and we don't have access to be able to continue the ability to collect material for cultural production, so whether that's, you know, there's been a whole renaissance of movement in the southeast in particular with weaving, lots of work with galleries and museums and community to repatriate that knowledge and look at how, if we're not going to collect that material, that mineral, or having the ability to engage with it and have a form of production, it impacts on our spiritual economy, it impacts on our ability to maintain connection to culture, and I think it's more important than ever. I wanted to mention that Professor John Altman's research looks at sustainable economic development in policy issue. He looks at hybrid economy frameworks, tourism, art and industry, and he's an amazing professor, especially as it relates to land and sea, and that alliance of what that management is. So I think when we talk about what's happening in Australia in terms of, you know, we're so endangered of being overcome by the changes in our climate, that Indigenous knowledge and philosophy in engaging in supporting the practices and the people that ultimately manage those spaces, I think now's the time, and it's a great opportunity for fire stick farming, for looking and working with Australia's First People to come up with the solutions, and creatives. So if there's a problem, there's this thing called design thinking. And I think if there's creativity or design thinking applied to, whether it's our living spaces, our ability to be able to design, you know, spaces that help people have a more, you know, balanced lifestyle, then I think that we would be less, would have less problems probably to try and solve, I guess. But yeah, I kept thinking about a whole lot of stuff just listening to different professors and psychology. So thanks, you've brought up heaps of ideas for me.
Nicole, you've just beautifully answered the next question I had.
Okay.
But I'll say what I was going to ask, because I think that you've really highlighted this, and that the question was, what partnerships do you think might be forged to capitalise more fully on the positive links between human consciousness and contact with nature in our local surroundings? And I think you've highlighted that need very much for Indigenous Australians and policymakers and practitioners to all link for us to get the best outcomes in the context, as Tristan noted, of climate change, as Sarah noted, of people being pressured time-wise and screen connected, and of people that David talked about being stressed for a variety of reasons. I think it's a really important link that you've drawn there that shows us that really we have some of the answers here just waiting for us to collaborate across the divides instead of dividing people into camps of science, art, nature, etc., economics. I think it's really the need to bring it together. Is that what you...
Well, I think even just this opportunity to have a conversation really is a platform to be able to engage, right? So having art, I always feel that art, in whatever you define art as, whether it's contemporary, multidisciplinary, look, there's lots of terminology you can apply to it. But ultimately, it's about providing different points of view and solutions and your engagement with it. The other thing I just wanted to mention was that there's some amazing young men coming out of community services and training that are looking at incarceration and looking at the way that policy is designed and how people, who may suffer from mental health, who come from a background like an Indigenous background, who may be incarcerated. So I was thinking a lot about those things too, and how people are advocating for alternative spaces and programs as a way to defer or be less likely to be, sort of incarcerated and ultimately become, products of a system that doesn't really look at rehabilitation. So there's lots of things that came out of it. It's not just about, great, let's have a walk in sort of this world. Nature or the ability to be able to restore, like what was mentioned, can be applied to so many different things that we, could just solve so much, I think. Yeah.
Yes, thank
Getting
you.
a little bit overwhelmed, but...
No, look, and the point that you made about incarceration, when Tristan was talking about counselling rooms, dark counselling rooms, I immediately thought, people who are incarcerated are blocked off from nature, and this is not helpful. I think we've come to the point where we might take some questions from the audience. So, Helen, if you were available to bring some of those to us, the panel would be happy to answer them.
Great. So our audience out there today, you'll notice you have a Q&A option in Zoom. So you're very welcome to send through any questions to that Q&A section, and we will answer those live for you.
And in the meantime, are there any comments, the panel, wrap-up comments the panel members would like to make? Sarah, anything you'd like to say?
Unmute myself. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's been really lovely to join this. I guess just reflecting on where we are now in the world with this COVID ongoing situation, I guess it's, I guess I find it heartening that it's illuminating what I kind of already know, but I feel like a lot of people are going, yeah, the natural world, that's what we're missing. Like I work in audio, and there's become this huge market for nature soundscapes, like field recordings, and people just putting up recordings of standing in a field or standing in the bush or a river, or, it's people are literally just going, they didn't know that that's what, it's surprising, I think, to some people. And I've read about how in the US, kids are saying that they're really missing not being able to go outside, and they might not have even thought that that would be the case. And so I guess I hope that that's something that we all take on into our lives beyond COVID, of recognizing how important, and like you say, access to green space is huge. And it's really noticeable. I feel so fortunate to have a back garden, to have an urban river nearby. And then I think I'm envious of people who live, in the bush or at the beach, because I think they've got even better access. And I hope that it's become something that urban planners and governments really know going forward. Okay, this is really important, and especially if we're not able to travel, if it becomes that everyone is traveling less and we are staying closer to home, that we do look at making sure that there's access to green space for everybody.
Great. We have a question here from Christina Roundtree, Thank you all for this fantastic conversation. I wonder where there already may be opportunities and invitations for such cross-disciplinary work to use design thinking. Thanks for this reminder, Nicole, for problem solving, accessing this wisdom of the value of healing nature. So where are the existing opportunities? Anyone who'd like to respond to that?
I think there's so many opportunities that are there. I know there's a major public art movement, you know, there's different kind of architecture and, you know, people are already thinking about these things. I've been involved in a number of them. I've supported, you know, the creation of a child and wellbeing centre in Western Sydney. So having artists and architects working together with Aboriginal communities to look at spaces for, you know, childcare centres. So it's happening, and the opportunities will only grow, I think, you know, the more we're open to them. So they're out there and they're definitely continuing.
Great. Another question from Liz Asser. Long-term traditions around spa or natural therapies derived from water, mud and earth, do these have relevance in modern therapeutic application? Tristan and or David? Tristan first.
Yeah, I saw that question. That's a brilliant question, and I'll just be careful about how I respond to it though, because what I'll say is that, you know, counselling and psychotherapy, a lot of people, I mean, one way to read about it or to make sense of it is as a cultural ritual, essentially, and it's a cultural ritual that some people might say is arrived out of urbanized living, essentially, from, you know, towards the end of the, what do we say, 18th century. So these are other rituals that predate counselling and psychotherapy that perhaps among certain cultures are used to improve mental health, well-being, and other sort of personal values. So there is a movement, it's about 30 years old, if not more, around sort of called eco-psychology. And then there's other names around that as well. And some of those practitioners tend to incorporate other kind of traditional methods of healing. So I just sort of be careful about that myself, as not being, you know, from operating from more of a Western approach, and also I've got to be careful about sort of commenting on things without evidence per se. But I only say that, but my view is that counselling psychotherapy is a cultural ritual, and there are other I'm sure very effective other rituals which, you know, are likely to be very effective too, and there are some people who would employ them. Yeah.
David, any comments on that? Sorry, you're muted.
There we go. I do now. So yes, to start with, when we think about from a scientific perspective, one of the areas that kind of has been really had big influence is something called attention restoration theory. One of the important key aspects of attention restoration theory is to be out in a kind of a soft fascination and natural environment, oftentimes waterscapes that have this gentle flow like a river or water that's kind of moving gently, captures your attention and doesn't, but it captures it in a way that doesn't kind of, it's not disturbing, it's relaxing. So attention restoration theory would say that being away, soft fascination, and kind of the extent of kind of exploring a natural space in water is one of the best places. When we kind of look at the brain, one of the things we see with attention restoration theory is that the frontal part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is kind of your decision-making, planning, problem-solving part of the brain rests. And we see a different part of the brain that's a different attentional network. It's called the default mode, starts to upregulate. So you kind of rest your prefrontal cortex and you let a different part of the brain kind of come online. That's the same parts of the brain that you see with kind of mind wandering or being in the moment. And so we can actually see changes in the brain that kind of relate to attention restoration and to some of these important aspects of the physical world.
Great, okay. And I think you've answered another question there, which was about attention restoration theory. So we'll move on from that one. Deborah White says, I regard walks in nature as moving meditation. I was wondering whether there are studies that show similarities between states of meditation and being in nature. David, you might be in a position to answer this as well.
Yeah, that's the same kind of default mode in the brain that lets that problem-solving prefrontal cortex rest. You see with kind of meditation or kind of this mind wandering, where your brain is active but kind of just gently kind of flowing, lets that problem-solving part relax, rest. And then when you start to think of a new problem, where you get this burst of creativity because the creative part of the brain has kind of been replenished and it's been restored.
Yeah, great. Now this is a question I think for Nicole and perhaps also for Sarah. How important is it for us as a nation to recognise the legal rights of Australian First Nations peoples to lands? Could this help reshape the way we all understand our connection to place and the role that nature should play in our society?
I feel like Nicole should go first on that, being a First Nations person.
I'm not first, but I think it's incredibly important. Land and sea rights movement, and again, I'll point you to an expert that really has future sight on what that actually means, especially from a remote community perspective, and infrastructure, building, social housing, health, art, it's all related. So if I could just redirect you to the writings of Professor John Altman, and I've put it also in the chat. He's one of the greatest writers who articulates in a way that government and policymakers understand. I sort of more would relate to that in terms of my personal connection and the ability for me to retain my cultural right and my birthright. But I think Professor John Altman really talks about, you know, why it's so important to maintain more in a political, social, policy and economic way. I'm not as smart as him, so I don't think I'm giving the answer any justice, but I read his work a lot and it makes complete sense.
Thank you. And Sarah, any observations on that?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think I'm conscious when, you know, sometimes particularly when I'm in the natural world and in sort of more wild places that, you know, that I'll go for a bushwalk and there'll be like an amazing sandstone cave that around sort of the outskirts of Sydney, it's quite amazing sandstone formations, and I'll feel like that feels like somewhere that Indigenous people would have hung out and just sheltered and collected food and things, and yeah, absolutely. Of course there needs to be more recognition and there needs to be a treaty and things in Australia. I'm from New Zealand, so I'm sort of I do feel like there's a bit of a disconnect here in Australia, and I certainly, in terms of reconnection with the natural world, I would personally like to learn more about Indigenous connection, because I do think that there's, from the little that I have read and know, that there's Indigenous people have an amazing, there's this the whole everything about the culture is connection through land, and so I think that would be certainly, like, I'm trying to just educate myself and learn more, but I do think that would be a way to further connect with the natural world. Absolutely.
And this final question, we're running out of time, but from Jenny Kelly, why are there not more plants and greenery in hospitals? It hasn't occurred to me before. Is this why we usually select flowers to power up someone's mood for recovery? I'm actually going to take that one myself, because I relatively recently supervised Dr. Rona Weerasuriya's PhD research on hospital gardens. She did a study in Melbourne here and found that hospital gardens were of benefit to staff, to visitors and to patients. So they were enormously important. And our own experience in our family, our younger son was in a psychiatric ward of a major hospital here in Melbourne. And the tragedy, or one of the tragedies associated with that, was that in the locked ward of the hospital, when people were not allowed out, the open space was derelict, a brick wall, a bit of weed and concrete, and that was all there was. Whereas in the open ward of the hospital, there was a beautiful garden, even though those people were allowed to go out to the local park. And it seemed to me that that was completely the wrong way round. And I think that Rona's research shows very clearly that it's really important to have gardens and greenery in hospitals and for people to have views. Roger Ulrich's study that David mentioned before of patients recovering more quickly when they have views of nature really underlines the importance of green spaces in hospital environments. Helen, I think we've run out of time for answering questions.
Yes, unfortunately, that is all we have time for today, but thank you so much to everyone that sent in some questions there. We've had quite a few come in and we unfortunately just don't have time to get to them all, but I'd just like to thank all our panellists today so much for joining us for this discussion, and thank you for giving up your Saturday afternoon to be with us. It's been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And have a good evening, good night, David, and good afternoon to the rest of you.
Thanks, guys. See you.
Thank you.